on commence en ce moment le 8e panel. Je vous demanderai, s'il vous plaît, de rester en silence derrière, s'il vous plaît. J'ai le plaisir de modérer le panel numéro 8, les responsabilités de l'Europe, de l'échec d'Oslo à la destruction de Gaza. Nous avons trois panélistes assez extraordinaires, je dirais, Andrea Teti, Sonia Boulos et Dimitris Bouris. Andrea Teti est professeur associé des sciences politiques à l'université de Salerne, en Italie, et rédacteur en chef adjoint de Middle East Critique. Il est un expert reconnu des relations entre l'Union européenne et la région MENA, de la démocratisation, de l'autoritarisme, de la politique de production des connaissances en sciences sociales sur le Moyen-Orient. Il est l'auteur principal de Arab Springs in Egypt, Jordan and Tunisia, 2018, et Démocratisation Against Democracy, How the European Union Policy Fails the Middle East in 2020. Dimitris Bouris est professeur associé titulaire de la chaire Jean Monnet au département de sciences politiques à l'Université d'Amsterdam. Il est également rédacteur associé de la revue académique européenne European Security, et professeur invité au Collège d'Europe. Il est l'auteur de The European Union and Occupied Palestinian Territories, A State Building Without a State in 2014, et a largement publié sur le rôle de l'Union européenne en Palestine et en Israël. Ses recherches portent sur les perspectives critiques du rôle de l'Union européenne en tant qu'acteur global, ainsi que sur les questions de reconnaissance internationale et d'États contestés. Et finalement, Sonia Boulos. Sonia Boulos est professeure associée de droit international et des droits humains à la faculté de droit et de relations internationales de l'université Antonio de Nebrija. Ses recherches portent sur la protection internationale des droits de l'homme. Elle est responsable du groupe de recherche Sugerico, sécurité, gestion et risques et conflits, et membre fondatrice du CEARC, le Centre de Estudios Árabes Contemporáneos. Elle est également coéditrice de Palestine Israel Review. Donc, on commencera. Je vais donner tout de suite la parole à nos intervenants. On commencera par Andrea Teti. Je voulais juste prendre 2 minutes, d'abord pour féliciter l'équipe du CAREP, non seulement pour l'organisation du colloque, qui est très important, mais aussi pour se focaliser sur un sujet qui n'est pas, à mon avis, très bien étudié, qui est celui du rôle de l'Europe en Palestine. Je vous félicite aussi de tenir bon, malgré la censure honteuse, cautionnée en fait par les autorités françaises. Et ma remarque, c'est que cet incident, je pense qu'il nous force d'une certaine façon à repenser notre relation au droit et à la loi plus généralement. Si vous pensez bien, si vous y réfléchissez, on se rappelle bien que pendant les années 60, 70, 80, notre rapport au droit et à la loi était complètement différent. En fait, on avait une critique du droit et de la loi. Et on organisait nos stratégies politiques et légales en considérant la critique du droit, c'est-à-dire ce droit qui effectivement avait une tendance, une origine et une pratique qui était très en accord avec des dynamiques impériales et coloniales. Et donc, Et donc, à l'époque, on avait développé des stratégies, même légales, qui considéraient cette critique. Et on a des exemples, comme dans le cas français, l'avocat Vergès, Gilles Vergès Jacques Vergès, pardon, et sa stratégie appelée des ruptures, donc qu'il s'agissait fondamentalement de nier en fait la légitimité des autorités et du droit pour juger les mouvements, les membres du mouvement de libération nationale, particulièrement en Algérie, mais pas seulement. Et on a vu des stratégies similaires se développer pendant le mouvement des droits civils en Amérique du Nord, mais on l'avait vu aussi avec les indigènes en Amérique latine, etc. etc. Bah, ma remarque, c'est qu'il faudrait quand même réfléchir à cette évolution où de cette stratégie de rupture, qui était celle qui niait la légitimité des autorités coloniales et la violence coloniale et du droit du pouvoir colonial, on se retrouve aujourd'hui limité, confiné, d'une telle façon que et l'incident de l'annulation de ce colloque est un exemple, que notre stratégie de rupture, et c'est là toute l'ironie, c'est la demande de l'application de la loi. C'est-à-dire que la pure demande de l'application de la loi est devenue aujourd'hui une stratégie de rupture en elle-même. Et l'on dit long de l'évolution de l'espace politique en France et ailleurs. Andrea, c'est à toi. Merci.
Bon, merci. Je vais parler en anglais, mais à propos de la loi, je me souviens que Giovanni Giolitti a dit la loi s'applique, s'interprète pour les amis et s'applique aux ennemis. Donc là, on a une espèce de map dans l'application de la loi de qui est un ami et qui est un ennemi. Bon, so forgive me, I apologize also to the translators and interpreters for what I'm going to do, which is to give most of my talk in English, but then say a few things in French. And if I remember to put my glasses on, that helps. So, like everyone else, I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation, for the work that they've done. I think none of us can thank them enough for what they've done under the circumstances that they've done it. And I can only say that I'm deeply grateful for making sure the event goes ahead, for their generosity and with their patience with all of us collectively, as well as having to deal with the external situation. So I'm going to make a small remark that frames what my argumentation is going to be, and I'm going to make then a quote in French. I'll be interested to see if you guess who the person I'm quoting is. So yesterday and today we've heard colleagues trace the European Union's multidimensional failures in relation to the question of Palestine and Israel, mappings, for example, of the institutional complexity and internal divisions between member states, which have compounded the EU's inaction. We've heard analyses of the tensions and contradictions between EU rhetoric and practices, which is one of the things that I've spent most of the last 15 years doing, because like any good nerd, which we academics all are in some extent, if you hear someone make a claim, you then say, okay, let's check. So that led me to about 15 years of analysis of what the European Union says and thinks it does in relation to, for example, democracy promotion, human rights, fundamental values, especially in the southern neighborhood, and what it actually does, yeah? Especially in comparison to the audiences that it's addressing. Thirdly, the role of lobbies. We heard some fantastic presentations this morning on lobbies on both sides, how international humanitarian law, international law is broken or simply ignored, à la Giolitti. And we've had excellent multidimensional historical reconstructions of the trajectories of the question of Palestine, its multiple dimensions, from water to political history, etc. Right? For those of you who know me, know that I am not a scholar of Palestine, nor Palestine-Israel, so I'm not going to speak about that. But because I am have some inclinations towards political theory, I will ask dumb questions like, let's check, and see what the results of those naive questions are. So my contribution focuses on some of the causes and consequences of Western, particularly European governments' failure to rein Israel in, faced with the systematic violations of international humanitarian law. I want to reflect on certain structural causes of those failures to then tease out some consequences which I think are particularly serious, again at a structural level, of consequences of those same failures. So that having been said, I think it's important to address the elephant in the room of this work, which is that I'm interested in the politics of epistemic frameworks, right? How we think we understand things, how we present things, how these things are connected to our actual practices, what we silence and what we foreground. And that's the reason why I did what one should never do, which is modify one's talk just shortly before giving it, to insert, amongst other things, this quote. And I apologize in advance for the quality of my French, but there we go. So the quote is this: Je me suis demandé si nous ne faisons pas, nous autres occidentaux, des grandes illusions sur nous-mêmes. Nous nous imaginons volontiers que nous sommes une civilisation très tolérante, que nous avons accueilli toute forme du passé, toutes les autres formes culturelles étrangères à nous, que nous accueillons aussi toutes les déviations de langue, du comportement, de sexualité, etc. Moi, je me demande si ça n'est pas une illusion. Comment dire? Pour pouvoir connaître la folie, il a fallu l'exclure. Peut-être pourrait-on dire aussi que pour connaître les autres cultures non occidentales, les cultures dites primitives, ou les cultures américaines, africaines et chinoises, etc., pour connaître ces cultures, il a sans doute fallu non seulement les exclure, non seulement les mépriser, mais les exploiter, les conquérir et en quelque sorte par la violence les faire taire. Telle sorte que, si vous voulez, mon hypothèse c'est ceci: l'universalité de notre savoir, notre occidental, a été acquis au prix d'exclusion, d'interdit, de rejet, au prix d'une espèce de cruauté à l'égard de toute la réalité. End quote. Can I get anyone to guess? Apart from the people I've told, yeah? Can I get anyone to guess who this person is? Any guesses? No? There's a very big hint. Pour pouvoir connaître la folie, il a fallu l'exclure. In order to know the madness, we had to exclude it. C'est Michel Foucault, voilà. Yeah? In 1971, okay, what is interesting to me here is that what he's saying is that maybe there are forms of knowledge, ways of European, Western ways of knowing that require silencing, a cruauté à l'égard de la réalité, okay, a cruelty in relation to facts, to reality that we have around us. So knowledge is generated only through this kind of cruel destruction, okay? So the reason I'm including this, aside from the fact that I think it speaks to much of what's been said in the last 2 days, is that this, I admit, is the strategy behind my supposedly naive series of questions, which are, let's check what it is that major actors do or say they're doing, and whether it has in relation to the question of Palestine-Israel, and let's see if they have a reasonable chance of being right. So, for example, first question, 2 questions, and then we reason on the consequences. First question is, what are the reasons behind Israel's systematic and devastating violence in Gaza? Okay. The second question is why it is that European and Arab governments have, by and large, with due exceptions of degree, but I think they are just questions of degree, failed to act concretely to rein in that violence, despite legal dimensions, not to mention ethical and political and so on. So I'm going to set those to aside for a second, problematic operation, for sure, but ask myself, I think we should do this, is ask ourselves whether what actors say they're doing has a reasonable chance of being true and effective. Okay? So let's start with Israel. When one listens to political commentators, politicians, academics, yeah, explain why Israel uses the violence that it uses, they will usually say something like, well, one answer one hears is that it's geopolitical, that Israel's use of violence is aimed at achieving security and stability in its immediate neighborhood, and in particular, this violence is said to be necessary to achieve the elimination of A, armed groups, and B, armed resistance as a strategy. Okay, now, in itself. One notorious example of this argument, of course, is the so-called Dahiyya doctrine, right? That intentionally inflicting massively disproportionate damage, including on civilian infrastructure and populations, will guarantee that enemies will be delayed, deterred, and think harder about taking up arms. Now, setting aside questions of evident questions and urgent questions and extremely important questions of legality or ethics, I have always found this an odd answer, because we know from scholarship on insurgencies, for example, that mass casualties inflicted upon civilians do not produce, in fact, exactly this opposite effect. So my strategy is here to take the statement and then look at scholarship to see whether we know something about that statement, right? And the scholarship on counterinsurgency, especially on bombing campaigns, for example, in Vietnam, or counterinsurgency in Afghanistan, etc., tells us that that strategy produces exactly the opposite effect to the one that is claimed to be its goal, right? It bolsters radicalization and opposition to occupiers because, funnily enough, civilian populations, non-combatant populations, don't really like being bombed, right? Apparently this is surprising. I don't quite know why. Is that all that scholarship tells us? No, scholarship tells us quite a lot of other things as well. Amongst other things, for example, another line of scholarship suggests that an alternative course of action, research on the so-called inclusion moderation hypothesis, suggests that at least in certain circumstances, the participation of previously extra-parliamentary groups in elections, the politics of democratic elections, etc., tends to facilitate their political moderation. So, of course, there are always exceptions and so on, but largely speaking, this is the case. Could this be relevant to our situation, to the Israeli intention of eliminating armed groups and armed resistance as a strategy? Well, it turns out yes. Because, for example, it's striking that since the electoral victory in January 2006, which was in any case by a small plurality, Hamas's electoral victory, its popularity has trended downwards over the last nearly 20 years. Yeah? The only exception to that, well, there are actually two exceptions to this. You see spikes in popularity for Hamas. This is using survey research polls with all the limits that we know of those, but this is fairly true also if you use fieldwork as a source. Spikes during two types of incidents. One, Israeli attacks, and two, infighting between political factions, Palestinian political factions. Okay. And here's an interesting fact that I think far too many people forget. Arab Barometer survey, right, concluded on October 6th, 2023. And it asks standard questions like, do respondents trust political parties, institutions, etc., including Hamas? And in the case of Arab Barometer for Palestine, what do people want? Are they happy with a two-state solution or whatever, right? And the answer by 2/3 to 3/4 amongst Gazawis is strongly yes. So you have, on the eve of October 7th, 2/3 of the population that are that don't trust Hamas, and 3/4 that support. Well, the question is a two-state solution, but basically peace of some kind, long-term structural peace, right? What happens after several weeks of bombings? Funnily enough, the popularity of Hamas peaks, right? So this trend over 20 years suggests that the inclusion moderation approach is right. The best way, even taking it cynically, the best way of undermining Hamas, if this is your goal, as a radicalized force connected to armed struggle, and so on and so forth, would simply have been to let it govern in normal circumstances, right? And I know that the terms that I'm using are loaded, very much so, okay? But nonetheless, I think this is the lesson we can look at, gain from scholarship, which is a lesson which is available to everyone. It's not exactly a mystery. This is not a state secret, yeah? Let's look at the European side now. So European governments' choice not to act has several tangible consequences for those governments. Can you remind me when I'm 10 minutes or 5 minutes? Okay, right. For example, damage to European states, and I mean, by the way, when I say European, I mean European individual governments, the European Union as a whole, and I include Great Britain in this. I would like to thank, I think, Mandy yesterday for talking about Great Britain and not England, for two reasons. First of all, I've spent about 30 years in Scotland, so when people mention England as a stand-in for Britain, it annoys me, but also because, if you don't know this, Scotland has a long and miserable and indignified history of its own colonialism, both independently and after the Union of Crowns in 1707, as part of the British colonial enterprise. So there we go. Anyway, so damage to European states' reputation, in this sense, to their so-called normative power and to their soft power, but also damage to trans-regional security and stability, which, remember, is the overarching, at least since 2015, really since 2013, is the overarching goal of European Union foreign policy and that of member states individually. So we're doing what we're doing because for geopolitical reasons, hard, realist, blah, 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 we increase, it may be unpleasant, it may be not particularly legal, but we do it because it increases stability and security, okay? But third form of damage to costs of this, of Europeans, states, governments' alignment is that it has knock-on effects through destabilization and insecuritization on migration, on their domestic legitimacy, and on domestic internal political mobilization, okay? Third element that I'd like us to consider is the fact that both European states and especially energy-producing states, including Arab states, are far from free or unable to access leverage, yeah, that they can use in order to rein in Israel's devastating violence, in order to prevent incurring those costs, in order to prevent the destabilization and the decrease in security at a local and trans-regional Mediterranean, Euro-Mediterranean level. So Europe has commercial ties, energy producers have energy ties or influence on the global energy market. Egypt has a treaty with Israel. We remember this, yes. And security cooperation and defense purchasing in both directions, as the panels this morning mentioned. And not to mention, of course, legal obligations, which states and the European Union as a whole are already subject and always subject to, whether we're talking about European Union law, whether in international humanitarian law, etc., right? So, for example, the constitutional crisis that colleagues mentioned this morning exists, and it is born from the fact that at the EU level, it is born from the fact that on the one hand, European Union states have those obligations, and on the other hand, the fact that they fail to pursue them through institutional mechanisms of the European Union, and the question of the EU-Israel Association Agreement is a perfect example of this. So the consequences of inaction by European states, Arab states, combined with the availability of alternatives, suggest it would be rational for these states to attempt to oppose or at least rein in Israel's use of violence, yet barely anything happens. So given these interests and available means, why do such states fail to exert any significant pressure, right? And I think the difference between the contribution that I'm hoping to make, 5 minutes, and the contributions that we've had so far, I think what I can maybe add to this is that I want to connect this to the strategies of domestic rule within each of the 3 sets of countries, right? So regardless of the rationales for foreign policy, use of violence, Dahiyya doctrine style, and so on, Israel's maximalism and its suprematism are driven by strategies of rules based on mass mobilization. How is politics framed, articulated, governed, controlled? Through mass mobilization. Of course, maximalist, suprematist, so ever towards, further towards the right. This helps explain Israel's political shift to the extreme right and its growing unprecedented use of violence. These positions serve neither domestic nor regional security or stability. They cannot achieve these goals, yeah? But they do serve the internal logic of Israeli politics. By contrast, European and Arab states, again, I want to emphasize, in their enormous diversity of the political, social, and economic systems that we're talking about, but it seems to me that they're both trending, the Arab counterparts for a long time, European states more recently with so-called, democratic backsliding and so on, that they're both trending towards forms of political control, forms of politics that rely on mass demobilization, okay? Arab rentier states have done this for decades. More recent neo or partially rentier states like Egypt have done so more recently, and so on. But I think that in the European context, this can be connected to this kind of legitimacy deficit that has been created over the last 40 years or so of neoliberal reforms, because the reaction that European states have had, and the European Union as a whole, has not been the reaction to austerity, to the consequences of austerity, which have been political mobilization in protest, right? It's not been to adjust to deal with the structural problems of austerity, in other words, address the social and economic rights and social justice dimension of democracy, but it's been to abandon that and cover that, on the one hand, with what you could call xenophobia surfing. It's someone else's fault, yeah? And on the other hand, with repression that we see very selectively applied, for example, in the case of Palestine protests. Okay. Now, the final thing that I want to do is connect all of this to so-called peace processes. So how does this help us? It helps us understand why it is that Israel pursues the strategies that it does, despite the fact that they have no reasonable chance of success in foreign policy. It helps us understand why it is that European states and Arab states find it so hard to address the evident illegalities, injustices, and so on, the evident damage to their own interests. Because what it would require to apply international law, for example, to apply pressure on Israel in order to rein in its violence, let alone to actually negotiate peace, what that would require would be to effectively mobilize internal public opinion, which is already mobilized, right? What is the power, the symbolic power of Palestine in both Middle Eastern, well, in Arab politics and in European politics? It stands for human rights. It stands for emancipatory struggle. It stands for social justice, right? It has been adopted in several of these different struggles in this way. So for European states to pursue their own interests would mean to go against the strategy of demobilization, the reaffirmation of austerity and neoliberal politics of the last 45 years or so. Now, in these conditions, and I'll finish on this, in these conditions, so-called peace processes become self-defeating exercises, not in the sense, we were talking about this again with Mandy yesterday, not in the sense that we try, we do our best, and, nothing happens. On the contrary, the very premises, the conditions under which peace processes are conducted are likely, it's it's virtually certain that they will lead to the failure of the peace process. What are those conditions? Well, think about the structure of peace processes. Since the Camp David Accords, the original ones, remember there are two, yeah? There's the treaty between Egypt and Israel, but there's also an accord on Palestine, yeah? Because, of course, Anwar Sadat needed to try to save, at least look like he was saving himself, yeah? Which he failed to do, but there we go. What was the structure of that agreement? The structure of that agreement was, in a sense, exactly the same as Oslo. The structure was, we have a moment of negative peace. Remember Galtung, the difference between negative and positive peace. We have a negative peace, we have a trust-building period, and then we have final status negotiations in which we talk about the difficult things that we weren't able to talk about before. We resolve the structural issues behind the roots of conflict, colonialism, etc., and that resolves the issue. So we finally have lasting peace. You never get to stage 3. Why is it? Because in stage 2, yeah, in the trust-building phase, you always have spoilers, settlers, for example, yeah, that are not reined in. Why are they not reined in? Because there is, especially on the Israeli side, a permissive international environment, because European governments, Arab governments, and of course the United States have no interest or incentive to pursue the pressure, to apply the pressure that would be necessary in order for actual concessions to be made. And I conclude on this. What is the consequence of the way in which European states, we come back to European states, what's the consequence of the way in which European states have faced all of this? In other words, that they've chosen the path of repression. The consequence seems to me to be particularly serious because they have attacked, undermined, or begun to undermine at least 2 pillars of what we call the modern state. The universality of human rights, the universality of human rights, yeah? And equality before the law, or if you prefer, the rule of law, right? The equal application of the law, the exact opposite of what Giolitti was talking about. You don't choose who you like and who you don't like in the application of the law, that you apply the law equally, right? The only thing I'm going to say in conclusion to all of this is that when European states make that choice, they undermine not just, and this would be serious enough, their own modern state, crisis of legitimacy, etc., so on. They undermine not just the modern state as such, artificial construct, liberal construct as much as it is, but they also undermine and erode the international institutional framework that is built from public law to institutions upon that notion of the modern state. Okay? Now, whether we like the modern state, whether we like the international system of institutions or not, the point is that, maybe going back to Gramsci, the monsters that come after it are ones that we should be very, very careful about embracing. So thank you very much.
Andrea, c'est le tour de Sonia Boulos. Elle nous parlera, elle nous présentera un papier intitulé « De la rhétorique à la complicité, l'Europe et la crise du droit international à Gaza ». Merci, Sonia.
Okay, thank you. I want to join my colleagues in thanking all the... Mike. Now. Okay, thank you. So I just want to extend my gratitude to everyone working at CAREP for their courageous, response to the attempt to silence this conference. Now, this morning, now, and in other sessions, the law was always a topic, an issue that is being mentioned, not discussed, thoroughly, but it's being mentioned. And the underlying assumption was that the law exists if it's applied fairly. It could, put an end to, the genocide in Gaza, the apartheid regime that is, being imposed on Palestinians. But now I'm here to tell you a different story about the law. I'm going to talk a little bit about major legal provisions that are relevant to the debate. But my argument is that we have to understand that the law is not neutral. What Europe is doing, European institutions are doing, and some European states are doing, is not simply to ignore the law. That's what Donald Trump does. Says, I don't care about international law. What EU institutions are doing, they are reconstructing international law in a way that it would enable genocide, that it would make genocide legal option. So that's what I want to talk about. I'm going to try to be as brief as possible. I'm going to read. We know that we're the only obstacle standing between you and Francesca Albanese's panel and distinguished guests, so I'll try to be as fast as I can. Okay. In a 2011 publication commemorating 25 years of Spain's membership in the European integration project, Joaquín Almunia, Spanish politician and former vice president of the European Commission, claimed, what distinguishes the EU from other international organizations is the fact that the Union's most appealing asset is not economic, but rather lies in its principles and values. For decades, European political elites have indeed cultivated precisely this self-image: a moral actor, a guardian of human rights, a defender of international law. Yet, as we stand today, confronted with the genocide in Gaza, this narrative is crumbling. Francesca Albanese has rightly claimed Gaza is a revealer. It revealed the malleability of Europe's legal human rights framework. Gaza does not merely expose a rupture in the EU normative governance. More importantly, it reveals the extent to which the law itself can be reconstructed, narrowed, or selectively redeployed to justify political inaction or even complicity in Israel's flagrant violation of international law, including genocide. What Gaza illuminates is a deep pattern: the creation of what we might describe as the Palestinian exception, sustained by a broader condition that Ardim says has termed legal subalternity, a condition in which, even if Palestinians are formally recognized as right holders, they are structurally denied the protections those rights should entail. This pattern becomes most visible in two domains I want to focus on today: arms trade and economic relations with Israel. These are not peripheral. They are laboratories in which European political elites bend legal categories to excuse non-compliance with their most basic obligations, if not to say complicity in international crime. The starting point is the EU's own legal architecture. Article 3.5 of the Treaty of the European Union commits the Union to uphold international law, human dignity, and the principles of the UN Charter in its external action. Article 21 reinforces this commitment and places it at the center of the EU foreign policy. These provisions are repeatedly invoked when the EU condemns Russia's aggression, imposes sanctions on Myanmar, and lectures governments of the global South about universal value. And yet, Palestine functions as paradigmatic exceptional space, where legal principles are cited rhetorically and reconstructed with one aim alone: to suspend their applicability. This rupture became impossible to ignore in January 2024, when the International Court of Justice issued provisional measures in the case brought by South Africa against Israel under the Genocide Convention. The court found a plausible risk of genocide in Gaza and warned of a real and imminent danger to Palestinians. Prevention lies at the core of the Genocide Convention, as its full title suggests. As the court held in the Bosnian genocide case, the duty to prevent requires states to employ all means reasonably available to them to avert genocide, even where the actors in question are not under their direct control. This duty arises the moment a state knows or should have known of a serious risk that genocide will be committed. In such cases, responsibility is incurred if the state manifestly fails to take all measures within its power to avert genocide, when such measures might have contributed to preventing it. In assessing whether a state has discharged its duty, the ICJ emphasized that a crucial factor is the state's capacity to influence the actors likely to commit or already committing genocide. The court also drew distinction between the obligation to prevent genocide and complicity with genocide. Complicity requires that some positive action has been taken to furnish aid, or assistance to perpetrator of the genocide, whereas violation of the obligation to prevent results from mere failure to adopt and implement suitable measures. By affirming plausibility of genocide, the ICJ has placed all European states on notice. Given the EU's extensive trade and military relations with Israel, both the Union and its member states have, in the court's language, the capacity to influence effectively Israeli actions. Continued supply of arms to Israel is not only a breach of the obligation to prevent genocide, it may well amount to complicity in genocide in the legal sense. Now, this obligation is salient not only in relation to the ongoing genocide in Gaza, but also to Israel's broader domination of Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory. In July 2024, in its advisory opinion, the ICJ declared that Israel's continued presence in the OPT is unlawful. That is, violates the right to self-determination of Palestinians, the prohibition on territorial acquisition by force, and the prohibition on racial segregation or apartheid. Because all these norms are peremptory norms of international law, they generate obligations erga omnes. As the court emphasized, all states and international organizations bear legal interest in their enforcement and are specifically obligated not to aid or assist in maintaining such unlawful situation. The UN General Assembly subsequently translated these findings into concrete prescription, adopting a resolution requiring third states to cease the provision of and transfer of arms, munitions, and related equipment to Israel in all cases where there are reasonable grounds to suspect that they might be used in the occupied Palestinian territory. And yet, the EU and its member states have not acted in accordance with their obligation. This is precisely where the European legal framework should have been decisive. The EU has long portrayed itself as a champion of the Arms Trade Treaty, adopted in 2013. This treaty prohibits authorizing armed transfers where the exporting state has knowledge at the time of authorization that the arms or items would be used in the commission of genocide, crimes against humanity, grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions, attacks directed against civilian objects and civilian protected as such. Now, since the adoption of the EU common position on arms exports, EU member states have been legally obligated to deny export licenses if there's a clear risk that exported military equipment might be used in serious violation of international human rights law or humanitarian law, including genocide. The common position sets 8 criteria that states must apply when assessing export licenses, including 1, EU states must refuse or condition arms export licenses if they would breach international obligations, for example, embargoes by the UN or the EU itself. They must consider whether export would provoke or prolong armed conflict or aggravate tensions in the destination, and also, this is also important, they must take into account the risk of diversion, undesirable re-export or misuse. However, as commentators have highlighted, the interpretation of the criteria varies greatly among member states, leading to contradictory positions. This has led to the development of the user's guide, which provides guidance for national authorities on how to interpret and apply the criteria. This, again, proved to be ineffective. Like any decision that falls within the realm of common foreign and security policy, arms exports policy and activities conducted in this field are beyond the control of the Court of Justice of the European Union, and the European Commission has no power of enforcement. Armed trade decisions remain largely immune from juridical review, even in national courts. What looks like fragmentation in practice is a systematic dispersion of responsibility, a mechanism through which obligations become enforceable by design. Now, the easy way to frame this is simply to say the EU lacks enforcement mechanisms. This framing obscures deeper racist and colonial structures. The core problem is not simply weak enforcement. The problem is that in the case of Palestine, the law is actively reconstructed so that these obligations do not apply to Palestinians. So the Palestinian exception is manufactured at the level of legal interpretation, not merely at the level of institutional capacity. Germany provides the clearest examples of this process. Since October 7th, the German government has articulated an increasingly absolutist narrative of Israel's right to self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter. This narrative is offered without engagement with the legal limitations attached to self-defense, mainly necessity and proportionality. In the German discourse, self-defense becomes a totalizing category, a shield against scrutiny. Criticism of Israeli conduct is reframed as an assault on Israel's existence, and because of Germany's history, as an assault on Germany's own moral identity. This reconfiguration of the notion of self-defense conceals the reality of Israel's genocidal military campaign. As Francesca Albanese and the UN Commission of Inquiry have documented and argued rigorously, Israel's operation exhibits patterns of violence compatible not with lawful self-defense, but with genocide, systematic attack on civilians, deliberate starvation, and the destruction of infrastructure essential to human survival. To insist that such acts fall within the unlimited right to self-defense is to reshape international law so that it no longer constrains violence, but rather legitimizes it. Before the ICJ, in the case brought by Nicaragua against Germany, Germany defended its exports by drawing a distinction between lethal and non-lethal items. But this distinction is a legal fiction. Technologies categorized as non-lethal, surveillance system, targeting software, spare parts for aircraft and armored vehicles, communications equipment are essential to modern warfare. They enable drone strikes, facilitate ground operation, and maintain the infrastructure of siege and displacement. Economic relations display the same logic. And it's here that the debate over suspending the EU-Israel Association Agreement becomes particularly revealing. So far, the agreement remains intact. In other contexts, the EU sanctions machinery operated swiftly and decisively. In the case of Israel, it is immobilized. But beyond this paralysis, the very language in which the debate is framed is deeply misleading. When suspension of the association agreement is discussed, almost exclusively in terms of withdrawing tariff preferences or fiscal benefits for Israel, the core legal obligation is silently displaced. The obligation arising from the ICJ advisory opinion and from general international law is not primarily about whether Israel continues to enjoy preferential access to EU market. The core obligation is non-assistance, ensuring that EU trade, financial flows, and commercial activities do not entrench Israel's unlawful presence and policy in the OPT. They do not sustain an illegal occupation, annexation, and a regime that the court associates with racial segregation and apartheid. Focusing narrowly on customs advantages empties the fundamental obligation of non-recognition, non-assistance from its core. How much time? Okay. Generally speaking, in the Moghrabi case, the court asserted that the EU may, but not required, to adopt measures in response to human rights violations attributed to its associates. In the Brita case, this time focusing on Palestine, the court reduced the question of settlement illegality to a matter of tariff classification, transforming an obligation of non-recognition into an obligation to label products and leaving it up to consumers to decide whether to purchase them or not. So the court wants to end apartheid by putting a sticker on an apple, and you decide if you want to buy it or not. The 2024 advisory opinion made this minimalism indefensible. The court held that Israel's presence in the occupied Palestinian territory is illegal. It violates peremptory norms. It determined that all states and international organizations must refuse recognition, withhold assistance, and avoid any act that would entrench the illegal presence of Israel in Palestine. Here lies another key misconstruction. That is the persistent attempt to maintain fictional distinction between Israel as a normal commercial and between Israel's normal commercial activity within the Green Line and its activities in the occupied Palestinian territory. Because the Israeli economy and the settlement enterprise are deeply integrated, the idea that one can neatly separate economic relations inside Israel proper from those that support the occupation is largely illusionary. virtually all forms of cooperation risk entrenching illegality. By pretending that the EU-Israel trade within the green light can be insulated from the occupation, the EU manufactures illegal geography in which responsibility for entrenching illegality always lies somewhere else. But perhaps the most dangerous framing is this. The discussion of suspending or conditioning the association agreement is often linked to the humanitarian situation in Gaza, to visible suffering, to the destruction of infrastructure, or to ceasefire prospects. These are, of course, crucial concerns. Yet the legal argument is tied only to the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. It obscures what the ICJ actually emphasized as fundamental illegality: the violation of the principle of right determination of Palestinians, the prohibition of annexation, and the prohibition of apartheid. The duty not to recognize and not to assist flows from structural ongoing illegality of the regime imposed on Palestinians. In this way, the EU discourse on economic relations participate in the same reconstruction of the law we saw in arms trade context. Obligations erga omnes are reframed as optional sanctions, non-recognition is reduced to consumer labels, non-assistance is reduced to question of whether Israel still deserves tariff privileges. To summarize, what Gaza shows us, therefore, is not simply inconsistency. The Palestinian exception shows us how the EU institutions and EU member states reconstruct the law to excuse inaction, to deny protection, and ultimately to enable a genocide. Now, all my colleagues before ended on a positive note. I didn't have a positive note in my speech, but I want to say one. The same time that Europe is reconstructing international law to give legal cover for a genocide, we have to remember that the global south is doing exactly the opposite. They are precisely doing the opposite by using international law as a counter-hegemonic project, and I assume this mobilization, as we saw in the Hague Group, could give us a little bit glimpse of hope. Thank you.
Finally, we have Dimitris Bouris, son papier intitulé « L'Union européenne et l'assassinat de la solution à deux États ».
I'll do my best. I'm not known for speaking slowly, but I'll try to. Bonjour à tous. Merci de m'avoir invité à participer à cette conférence. C'est un honneur d'être ici en compagnie de collègues éminents. Un grand merci également aux organisateurs pour tout le travail, l'énergie et les efforts qu'ils ont employés pour que cette conférence puisse avoir lieu. I'm also sorry, I hope I'm not confusing the translators, and I hope that I didn't butcher your language either. I'm also sorry I could not be with you yesterday, but I joined a last-minute crash course on academic rigor so that I could convince the French Ministry of Education about my academic credentials. What I would like to do with you in the 20 minutes I have today is to present some ongoing research which I have done with my colleague Alexandros Lefteratos, and which emanates from more than 15 years of researching the European Union's role in Palestine. And before doing this, I would like to take a step back. I mean, it's very difficult to do this after all these presentations from all these distinguished speakers who have covered a lot of aspects already. But I would try to take a step back and provide a little bit the contextual background of where I'm coming from, where we are coming from. And number one is that colonial hierarchies are not just a matter of history. They still continue to accompany the way that the EU views this region, and especially Palestine. Second, Eurocentrism, the sensibility that Europe is historically, economically, culturally, and political distinctives in ways which significantly determine the overall character of politics, as Miriam Sabaratnam has put it. Thirdly, Orientalism, which is a conscious strategy and method through which the Orient is socially constructed, produced, and reproduced. All these kind of discourses are not just relics of the past, but they are mainstream viewpoints guiding European decision-making and further bolstering the line between the civilized self and the uncivilized other. Of course, I can refer to the whole analogy of the garden and the jungle, and I will also talk more about this in the very end. So the central aim that we had with this research, which is going to be published very soon actually, was to unpack and analyze how the EU upholds the two-state solution discursively, while at the same time it actively dismantles all the material conditions necessary for a Palestinian state to exist. So it's not about effectiveness, it's not about the EU's inability to bring peace or to forge a two-state solution, but it's about the active killing of the two-state solution. So our main argument is that the EU does not just fail to deliver a two-state solution, but it ensures its permanent impossibility through politics of delay, a hierarchy of survival, and racial politics, provisioning a slow death. The EU is financing the Palestinian subjugation rather than self-determination. And for anyone who is willing to read more about this, I would channel you to the amazing work which has been done by my colleague Mariam Salameh-Pouvogel. So what we say and what we argue is that Palestine is a pivotal locus for theoretical engagement and empirical investigation due to the subjection to terror, forceful replacement, and eliminatory settler colonialism. The European post-colonial management is bringing to light the preference of a temporary management over an actual addressing of the structure, which is enabling this illegal Israeli occupation, settler colonialism, apartheid, as well as the prioritization of certain lives over others. And we start with looking at what the literature or what people call high politics diplomatic activity, and how the idea of a Palestinian state, of the legitimate rights of the Palestinians, of the two-state solution was built up throughout the decades, and a lot of these things were mentioned by Daniela Huber yesterday, by Muriel Lazaburg as well, and a lot of other people. But what we do is a little bit of a contrapuntal reading, a very Saidian method. And we try to look behind all these statements, also what Andrea was mentioning, what is behind the words. So you see that, I mean, in the beginning, in the 70s, we have the Palestinians who indeed have legitimate rights there being recognized. Then we have the idea of a homeland from the Palestinian people emanating in the European Council conclusions. Then we have the idea of self-determination. Of course, we have the idea of a Palestinian state. Then with the Berlin Declaration, we had the readiness of the European Union to recognize a Palestinian state when appropriate or in due course. And of course, then we have more elaboration on the 1967 borders, et cetera, et cetera. So we try to look behind what lies behind all these statements. And with the Seville Declaration, for example, one of the things which the Seville Declaration said was that the reform of the Palestinian Authority is essential. So Palestinian statehood turned out not to be an inherent right, but something which needed to be proven and gained. With the so-called roadmap in 2002, which envisioned again full Palestinian statehood by the end of 2005, what we see is a change in terminology where, until that moment we had a lot of terminology about rights and justice. The change which the roadmap brought was the terminology was dominated by risk and urgency. And of course, you know, in 2009, we had the Fayyad plan, the Palestinian Prime Minister's plan on building the Palestinian state, which had a duration of 2 years. And in the end of these 2 years, we had all the major agencies and international organizations arguing that Palestinians are ready for statehood. The IMF was saying that the Palestinian Authority is able to conduct the sound and economic policies, expecting for a future well-functioning Palestinian state. The United Nations, in 6 areas where the UN is most engaged, governmental functions are now sufficient for the functioning of a state. Catherine Ashton, I don't think that many people remember her, but back then she was EU High Representative. She had argued on behalf of the European Union that today Palestinian institutions compare favorably with those in established states. Fast forward, EU member states were still unwilling to recognize this state, which they themselves have spent so much money to build in theory. So what we see gradually in this high politics level was an emphasis in EU statements which is placed on conflict management and humanitarian aid, rather than a political resolution which focuses on the structural reasons of why all this is happening. So statehood in rhetoric remain the stated goal, but they use language conceal the normalization of Palestinian disposability. The glorification of Israel as, and I quote von der Leyen here, a friend, an ally, a vibrant democracy that counts and must count in the region and whose resilience is admired worldwide, diverted all attention and by implication constructed an invisible wall of authoritarianism, barbarism, and primitiveness, rationalizing the Israeli settler colonial project. So what we argue is that EU diplomacy harbors colonial asymmetries that uphold a two-state solution discursively, but dismantle it materially, perpetuating an indefinite state of crisis wherein Palestinian suffering is just managed, but never ended. And of course, this slow death, which Sonia also talked about, because it's not only about what we see and what we have been witnessing the last 2 years, it's also about all the structures which bring the slow death, which are less visible. So slow death has been brought through legal complicity, and a lot of the things have already been mentioned. The whole EU-Israel Association Agreement and the absence of a border demarcation, the ICJ and ICC rulings, no concrete action, so how the EU uses the law but does not implement it. And again, Daniela Huber has published an amazing article in the Journal of Common Market Studies, which puts all these things in perspective. The EU itself conducted 3 formal reviews assessing Israel's compliance with the human rights clause of Article 2 of the Association Agreement. All of them concluded exactly the same thing. Language such as, and I quote, there are indications that Israel would be in breach of its human rights obligation. Now, in particular, the use of words such as indications and would for what has already been recognized from multiple genocide scholars and human rights organizations is clearly an attempt at relegating an organized and well-executed genocidal war into a humanitarian catastrophe that needs to be monitored every 2 weeks. This is EU language, not mine. It took the EU 23 months, it took the European Commission 23 months to propose some measures with regard to a partial suspension of the EU-Israeli Association Agreement on trade-related matters and sanctions against extremist minister. All of this really symbolic and extremely superficial. In the most recent ministerial meeting with countries of the EU southern neighborhood, The EU invitation was even extended to Israel for the purpose of discussing the Mediterranean Pact. Now, the paradox of discussing regional cooperation with the very same country that, according to the EU's own report, sustains occupation, violates international law, and commits atrocity in Gaza, this is really surreal to me, and I guess to a lot of other people. All this irreconcilable marrying of genocide with cooperates, which unfolds the very well choreographed business as usual EU engagement with Israel. Moving from the legal to the economic and funding the illusion of economic sovereignty in Palestine, the good thing with being with such an audience here is that I don't need to explain the Paris Protocol because all of you are aware of this, but how the EU has not contested the Paris Protocol and the structure which the Paris Protocol created, but instead it has contributed to strengthening all this by making all of its funding conditional on it. Israel still steers alive with the purpose of sustaining its overwhelming occupation. It plunges the Palestinian, no, that's for later, I'll change it, thank you. It plunges the Palestinian state into debts hardly manageable for any country under occupation. Numerous EU-funded projects have been demolished through the years without any compensation from Israel. Israel is the first beneficiary among non-EU participating countries in Horizon 2020 programs and the largest trading partner of the European Union. The European Union invests nearly twice as much as the US in Israel. So business as usual continues, including also the trade with illegal Israeli settlements and also European businesses profiting out of all this trade. So the EU subjects Palestine into all this strange conditionality, opting for what seems to be a technocratic approach, while barely any of this support has to do with economic independence and building an independent Palestinian state. And again, I would like to channel you to the work of Mariam Salameh-Pouvogel, who has written a lot and she has published on how civil society has been criminalized by the EU. But also, she has written with me an article, which again is going to be published very soon, on how in the middle of this genocide, the EU imposed new conditionalities on the Palestinian Authority. In July 2024, under the title Comprehensive Program for Palestinian Recovery and Resilience, the EU found the golden opportunity to ask for very big changes in the Palestinian textbooks and prisoners and the payment of prisoner salaries. Both aspects are perceived as sacred pillars of resistance to a settler colonial domination by the vast majority of the indigenous population of the occupied Palestinian territory. So our analysis with Mariam there is that these imposed reforms, which have been introduced against a background of an inconceivable violence against a colonized population, render visible the very racialized underpinnings of aid that seek to establish security through measures aimed at the prevention of alleged incitement. So overall, on the economic sphere, we see technocratic solutions that neutralize any claims of justice instead of confronting existing conditions underpinning Palestinian dispossession, and they suggest that colonial legacies still inform European policy making. And last but not least, the killing of the two-state solution can also be seen through the hierarchy of survival, which the EU has helped establish in Gaza. For months, the European Council struggled over whether to call for 2 minutes, for a pause, poses window or windows for a ceasefire, until finally in March 2024, by when over 30,000 people in Gaza had been killed. They didn't die, they were killed. And finally, the European Council called for an immediate humanitarian pause, leading to a sustainable ceasefire. 2 years of massacring and annihilation, the words Israel and Israeli are never featuring in EU official discourse in the context of the genocide in Gaza, thereby evading ownership and responsibility. The first ever mention that this happens was on the 10th of July 2025 by Kaja Kallas, whereas any precedent reference including the word Israel was exclusively in the context of the EU solidarity with the support for Israel. So there is a broader anonymization of the agent of violence, which evades responsibility and hence avoids potential confrontation over an issue which is highly sensitive. The EU's broader engagement in Gaza is complicit in labeling a deeply political stalemate as a humanitarian issue. It's not a hurricane, it's a live stream genocide. So it's not a humanitarian issue, it's an active genocide, which we have all watched in our screens. There is no EU statement, declaration, or announcement which raises the issue of Palestinian survival without linking this to that of the Israeli life. And I had prepared some slides here about the double standards, but my colleagues have already covered all these already. But for the people who said, oh, we didn't know, everything has been out there. All these statements by Israeli ministers have been out there. They haven't shied away. They were very clear on what they wanted to do and what they were planning to do. And the moment that one of them clearly talked about we are fighting human animals, the next day, von der Leyen and Metsola, the president of the European Parliament, were there meeting with the Israeli president. I'll skip the rest of the slides, a lot of surreal things throughout, but I'm sure you're aware of them already. The last surreal thing, just 2 weeks ago, Kaja Kallas, the EU High Representative at the Collège de France, saying the key to peace is law. This is what my students who are in their 20s would call trolling. And I'll leave it there. Just to summarize, we think that, and we believe through our analysis, through our academic analysis for the people at the Ministry of Education, that the EU does not just fail to deliver a two-state solution, but it ensures its permanent impossibility. Palestinian sovereignty remains alive only as a discourse while being systematically erased in practice. And I'll leave it here, and thank you for your attention.
Super, on est, je crois que dans les temps, un petit peu tard. Absolument, on a 5 minutes, c'était jusqu'à 16h30, c'est ça? On a 5 minutes, donc est-ce qu'il y a des questions? Oui, il y a.
When East Germany united with West Germany, the German government inherited a large amount of East German military equipment. And I read that helmets were sold to the government of Turkey, but the German government insisted that the Turkish army not use these helmets in their campaign against the Kurds in eastern Turkey. So we have a question of something as simple as a helmet being told you cannot use this in combat against the Turks. Is anyone aware of any other restrictions the German government placed on the government of Turkey in terms of acquiring military equipment from Germany? Because it seems to me as something as simple as a helmet being forbidden, and yet the active use of weapons is quite a contradiction. Thank you.
Merci. Il y a une autre question? Non? OK. Oh. Mais on a 5 minutes.
Hi, I just have a quick comment and then a quick question. My comment is about how I think 3 speakers I saw throughout the conference have often used Russia as a reference. 3 speakers throughout the conference, Professor Boulos, Professor Bouris, and yesterday the professor from Rice University, sorry, his name escapes me. You have all used Russia as a reference in terms of showing the West double standard in terms of condemning, Russian quote-unquote aggression and then being permissive towards or even supportive of Israeli aggression. I just have a question for Professor Boulos. You talked about at the very end, what gives you hope is that the third world, quote-unquote, the global south is using law as a, as a weapon against colonialism, imperialism. Other than South Africa, can you give other examples of how that is the case?
So you have the Hague Group, you have more than one country in the Hague Group trying to adopt the same strategy, making sure that these crimes, are met with, accountability. But I think one of the important examples of the use of law as a counter-hegemonic project is the advisory opinion itself. If you would have had this conversation 20 years ago about occupation, legally speaking, 20 years ago, occupation was considered a factual question. Either occupation exists or it doesn't exist. It's a question of fact. And if it existed, there are certain, rules that apply to it. I think it was a huge victory for Palestinians, the advisory opinion. They have been saying for many years that this approach is colonial, that you're going to treat occupation as a factual question. Occupation itself should meet, raises normative questions. So I think the advisory opinion in itself is one example. And I think also the way South Africa is using the Genocide Convention. They focused, for example, on the imposition of life conditions that would eventually lead to the partial or whole destruction of the Palestinian people in Gaza. They used it in a very interesting way. Instead of focusing exclusively about physical destruction, they looked at Palestinian as this tapestry that they cannot survive without, cultural institutions, without universities, without healthcare. So these are counter-hegemonic uses of international law that have been fruitful. Let's hope that this trend will continue.
Merci Sonia. Et une brève réponse à la première question? Non? Merci beaucoup.